Good morning, everybody. It is today, July 4th, 2026, making it the 250th anniversary or semi-quincentennial of July 4th, 1776. Because this weekend is so special, we're pausing for a moment with the Love Sweetie podcast to provide some bonus content this weekend in connection to the American Revolution. This connection is going to be through Sweetie's family, and we'll talk about her connection to the Revolution at the very end of the content. But the featured content of this episode is all about a man many of you, in fact, I would not be surprised if the majority of you have never heard of from those revolutionary days in Philadelphia. That man was Timothy Matlack, or the Scribe of the Declaration of Independence. The picture you can see on your screen, and for our audio listeners, if you want to see these pictures, just refer back to the YouTube video. There are only a few. This picture of Timothy Matlack was painted by the famous artist Charles Willson Peale, and it's thought that this picture of Matlack is from about 1790. But who was Timothy Matlack? Born on March 28, 1736 in Haddonfield, New Jersey, Timothy was born into a family of Quakers. He moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1738. This was basically so that he could be an apprentice to another Quaker who was a merchant. Timothy was both a businessman and a politician. However, his first business, which was a shop he called the Case Knife, failed in 1765. He had just opened it in 1760. He wound up in debtor's prison in 1768 and 1769, and when he got out of debtor's prison, he started selling bottled beer near Independence Hall, or what would become known as Independence Hall, in 1769. Timothy himself was a Quaker, but he was disowned by the Quakers. At the beginning of the American Revolution, he was involved first with the First Continental Congress, which had met in 1774 in Philadelphia. Timothy is the individual who engrossed an address to King George III, the product of the First Continental Congress. You see, Timothy had very good handwriting, very good penmanship. And with his selling beer near Independence Hall, I think it can be maybe assumed a little bit that all those delegates to the Second Continental Congress and the First Continental Congress who did like to drink probably knew where most of the good alcohol could be found near Independence Hall. There's no doubt in my mind that Timothy had built some relationships with these men prior to the First Continental Congress, and the subject had come up that he had extremely good penmanship. At any rate, in some way, he found himself in charge of being the scribe of this document from the First Continental Congress, and he did good work. So the Second Continental Congress hired him to do additional work over the years. He became a clerk to the Second Continental Congress in May of 1775, and in that same year, a month later, he was asked to compose George Washington's commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Because of his time in apprenticeship and his later work as a merchant, he also became the storekeeper of military supplies. Because he was the storekeeper of military supplies, among a few other roles, he was elected the colonel of the 5th Battalion of the Rifle Rangers in Philadelphia in January 1776. This leads us to the story of Timothy and the Declaration of Independence itself. I'd like to read a quote to you. The legend writ, the stain affected, the key in silence undetected, 55 an iron pen, Mr. Matlack can't offend. Now this quote might be the one reference that many of you might be familiar with or have ever heard in your lives. And this is the first clue in that movie National Treasure that stars Nicolas Cage. It's the very first clue, the key in silence, silence being the ship, from the beginning of the film. Matlack is actually noted here in this clue. 55 an iron pen, Mr. Matlack can't offend. The reason Matlack is mentioned in the clue in this part of the movie, which, spoiler alert, this movie is about stealing the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration would be engrossed by Timothy. He was hired by the Second Continental Congress to engross the Declaration of Independence on vellum. His handwriting, his penmanship, is the only handwriting on the document other than the signatures of the signers themselves. Timothy himself was not a signer of the Declaration of Independence, but his hand is seen more on that document than any other person who did actually sign it, simply because he wrote the whole text of it. I have to imagine his work and his meetings with individuals like Thomas Jefferson and the other members of the Committee of Five, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Philip Livingston of New York. I have to imagine the conversations he had with these men, as he would have been one of the first individuals to actually review the Declaration of Independence by merit of the work he'd have to do to engross the document. But Timothy didn't stop there. During the American Revolution, he also helped draft the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776. However, there were many people who didn't agree with some of the things in the Pennsylvania Constitution. And so he wrote articles in various newspapers in its defense under a different name. He chose to use the name Tiberius Gracchus. This is interesting because Tiberius Gracchus was the name of a popular Roman politician who lived from 166 to 133 BC, who had been the tribune of the plebs, or the plebeians, known for agrarian law reform. Unfortunately, Tiberius Gracchus was a Roman politician who was assassinated. Tiberius itself means from the Tiber River. There was a Roman emperor from 14 AD to 37 AD, named Tiberius Julius Caesar Augustus. I find it interesting that this one emperor named Tiberius was described as reclusive and somber. And then the term Gracchus, because of its association with the name Tiberius Gracchus, has become a popular word choice to represent a figure who advocates for lower classes to those in power. During the American Revolution, after engrossing the Declaration of Independence, Timothy crossed the Delaware River on December 27, 1776, with the 5th Rifle Battalion with George Washington. Remember, he was the colonel of that 5th Rifle Battalion. December 27, 1776 is after the famous crossing on Christmas Eve of that year and after the Battle of Trenton. But remember that there were multiple crossings made, and this was one of the crossings. He investigated Benedict Arnold, leading to Benedict Arnold's court-martial, and this is prior to Arnold being deemed a traitor, which would follow about 5 to 6 months later. Timothy then became a trustee of the University of the State of Pennsylvania in 1779 and a member of the American Philosophical Society in 1780. He was delegate to the Second Continental Congress in 1780, so while he had been a clerk previous to this, he became a full delegate at this point in time. He was one of the founders of the Religious Society of Free Quakers in 1781. And most importantly, Timothy was an opponent of the institution of slavery. In his later life, as Matlack lived for quite a long time, he did survey work in northwest Pennsylvania. From 1799 to 1808, he was living in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which at that time was the capital of Pennsylvania. He became the clerk of the Pennsylvania State Senate, and he eventually then dies in Holmesburg, Pennsylvania, on April 14, 1829. Now, if you do the math there, remember, Timothy had been born in 1736, so he lives to be 93 years old. This portrait of Timothy Matlack, thought to be painted around 1826, was also done by Charles Wilson Peale. Timothy was originally buried in Philadelphia at the Free Quaker Burial Ground. However, his remains were reinterred in the Wetherill Cemetery, which is very close to Valley Forge today. Here are some photos of a visit I took to the Wetherill Cemetery. These photos are from September of 2024. Timothy does have one of the Pennsylvania historical road markers. His gravesite is marked by both a stone in the ground and a headstone, with a symbol that he was a veteran of the American Revolution. Now, let's talk about Timothy's connection to Sweetie, or rather, Sweetie's connection to him. Sweetie's husband, of course, if you've been following along with the podcast since, well, let's say episode 13, Sweetie married Lewis Sidney Graham. He was known as Lew throughout his life, and Lew was the fourth great-grandson of Timothy Matlack. For the direct connection, here's the information. So, Lew Graham was the son of Sidney Bonsall Lewis. In our story, we hear all the time the reference to G-Mom Graham, Lew's mother. That's Sidney Bonsall Lewis. She was born in 1881. She was the daughter of Anna M. Matlack, who lived from 1843 to 1925. So Anna Matlack was Lew's grandmother. Now, Anna Matlack was the daughter of John Ristine Matlack, who himself was the son of James Matlack, who was the son of William Matlack, and William was the son of Timothy himself. So, if you count the generations here, remember, Lew is the grandson of Anna Matlack. This makes Lew the fourth great-grandson of Timothy himself. My father, Lew's son, Lewis Sidney Graham, Jr., this makes him the fifth great-grandson of Timothy Matlack. My father, Lewis, who's the voice of Chester in our story, is a current member of the Pennsylvania Society Sons of the Revolution. He's also a part of the color guard of that institution. Here's a picture of my dad from several years ago. This photo was taken at the Sheridan over in Society Hill in Philadelphia. This is right before the men of the color guard line up to parade the flags to Independence Hall from that location. My father in this photo is holding one of the revolutionary flags, and this is a naval privateer flag, which was used during the War of Independence. Now, this is a reproduction of the flag, but if individuals are wondering, the yellow and black stripes, that's what that represents. So this was in use by the Continental Navy. My father having served in the Navy, and his father having served in the Navy, I think that's why he prefers to hold this flag. What's important to note is that this small ceremony that often wasn't covered enough by the local news, always on July 4th, always to arrive at Independence Hall around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Every single person carrying the flag in that parade is a descendant of someone who served in the American Revolution. Hence the group, the Pennsylvania Society of Sons of the Revolution, or the PSSR, which is, to be very clear, a distinct organization from the National Sons of the American Revolution. So that concludes this presentation on Timothy Matlack and the connection of Timothy Matlack to our storyline with Sweetie. I hope everybody has a great semi-quincentennial or 250th of the 4th of July. Just remember, even though some people might have a smaller part of the story with regards to the American Revolution, it doesn't make them any less important to the greater story of freedom in our country. And I'm going to close this episode with a video of the descendants from the PSSR marching with all of those reproduction flags of the revolution. Remember, these are the descendants, and they're setting off in this video, as they did for many, many years, from the Sheraton at Society Hill in Philadelphia to Independence Hall on the 4th of July.